is I speak on the idea of resiliency and following your goals and your dreams. I want people to understand that, they're still here. Well, I woke up this morning, and that's a good thing, because there are many people that don't wake up every day. Over 7,000 people a day in the United States die. And what dies with them? Their dreams and their goals and the things that they didn't accomplish, the things that they didn't take a chance on and invest in themselves and say, I can do this. And that's what I want to help people understand, because for years in my life, I just went through the motions. There was a point in my life, I was very young. My mother had passed away when I was only 15, and I thought this was too hard. I didn't want to do this anymore, and I almost took my own life. I sat 3 different times with a handgun in my hand and thought, this is too hard. I don't want to do it anymore. But had I done that, had I let my life go, I would have let go all the things that matter to me that I didn't even know existed. Meeting my wife, having my twins, getting to watch them grow up, and learning about myself and who I am and what I can accomplish. And I learned that from watching my father suffer. My father suffered through a stroke when I was 10. He suffered through a broken hip and a heart attack. And then he suffered watching my mother suffer through cancer and die. And then years later, watching my brother die. 2 days shy of his 44th birthday. So we never know how much time we have left. And what we have to do is make the most of our time. And if I can help just one person get up off the couch and realize that they can follow their dream, and that whether they achieve their dream ultimately or not, as long as they are chasing it down every day, eventually they'll arrive at the point in time and place that they want to be. Well, at that point in his life, then, he just lived. I mean, he didn't, there are things he just couldn't do anymore, and he never worked again a day in his life after the stroke. Never worked again. And he worked hard. I mean, work was his thing. That's what he did. And after the stroke, he was never able to work again. I'm still here was, someone said, Tony, how you doing, Tony? He'd say, I'm still here. When he was in the hospital and the doctor would come in to see how he was doing, no matter how he felt, he always propped himself up and sat up, because he knew his goal was to get out of the hospital. Well, Les, what I speak to people about is the fact that they're still here, that I'm still here, that every day we wake up is a good day, because it sure beats the alternative. Over 7,000 people a day just in the United States alone die. Every 12 seconds, someone in America dies. And what dies with them? That's what we have to ask. What would go with me today if I died today? All my hopes and dreams, all my goals, all my ideas that I've never given myself to or never fully participated in. What would happen to those things? What would have happened if people didn't follow their dreams? Would we have the cures for the things that we have now? My father, I'll never forget, he had a stroke when I was only 10 years old. And it was devastating for me and for the family. And one of the things I watched about him was whenever the doctor came in the room, no matter how he was feeling, he always sat up, because his goal was to get out of the hospital. He was not going to become a permanent resident. He was not going to go the way of someone who dies every 12 seconds in America. He was keep going. He was always keep going. He was persistent. He had perseverance. And that's what I want to help people understand, that no matter what they're going through, that they have this opportunity of the following day, because every day they wake up is an opportunity to do something great. And what I want them to see and understand is what I learned, and it's what I tell my boys every day. There has never been a day in the history of the world that the sun did not rise, that the sun did not come up. They have to be there to greet it. You have to be there to greet it. I have to be there to greet it. We have to say to the day as it breaks, as the dawn comes up, we have to say, I'm still here, and I'm not going anywhere. And I'm going to do what I'm here to do, because that's what I was meant to do. Well, I would say the first step is perseverance. You have to have perseverance. Things are going to happen to you in life, Les. I mean, things have happened to me. And the idea is every day you have to get up and face that challenge. You can't just pack it in and move on. My father went through a crushed knee. They wanted to take his leg off, and he said, no way. Then he went through the stroke. He went through a broken hip and a massive heart attack and bypass surgery. Then he watched my mother die, and then years later he watched my brother die. My brother died instantly. He was 2 days shy of his 44th birthday. He had a blood clot just outside his heart. He played tennis with his youngest son. He walked in the house. He sat down on the couch, joked around with his wife about who didn't stir the pot of sauce that was on the stove. My brother was always cooking. And the blood clot broke off, hit his heart, and stopped him instantly. And I'll tell you, my brother, when my mother died, I had just returned from the hospital. I didn't want to leave, but my father said, go home, you can come back tomorrow. Well, unfortunately for my mother, there was no tomorrow because she died that night. And when I got home, the phone rang, and my aunt came to me, who had been staying with us, and she said, honey, she said, you have to go back to the hospital. Your mother's gone. But I knew I had to do one thing. I had to call my oldest brother, my brother Tony, who's my godfather, and I had to tell him. And I woke him up, and he answered the phone, and I said, listen, we have to go back to the hospital. And he said, why? And I said, well, I said, Mom's gone. And that was hard. That was hard to do. And I'll never forget it. And then years later, when my brother passed away, my brother called on the phone. I was mowing the lawn outside. It was getting late. I was trying to finish by the headlights of the tractor. My wife came out and said, your brother Tony's on the phone. And I was frustrated. I said, well, what does he want? I'm trying to finish. And she said, I don't know, but he said you have to come inside. And I panicked because I knew where my brother was. My brother was at the shore with his 3 children. And the week before, a strong college-age boy had gotten dragged out by the undertow and drowned. And panic came across me. God forbid something had happened to one of my nieces or my nephew. And when I got to the phone and I said, what's going on? And my brother said on the other end, and he said, Johnny had a heart attack. And I said, okay, all right, where is he? I'm thinking I'm going to get in the car and head to wherever he is. And all he said was, nope. And I didn't fully understand what he meant. And I said, what do you mean, nope? He said, nope, he didn't make it. And the pain of losing my mother and hearing that my brother had passed away, I'm the youngest of 6. And all the things that I went through with my father and all the dying and the sickness with my mom, the one thought that had never crossed my mind, which maybe it should have because I'm the youngest of 6. So it would maybe have been plausible to think that one of them would pass before me. But I had never, ever, ever had that thought. And at that moment, that reality hit me. And I realized that my brother was gone. And I want people to understand that tomorrow is not guaranteed. Life is hard. Katharine Hepburn says, life is hard. After all, it kills you. And I want people to understand that they have to live every day and they have to chase their dream and their goal. They can never give up. If you don't achieve it today, you'll achieve it tomorrow. And if you don't achieve it tomorrow, you'll achieve it the next day. But if you're not chasing it, then it's chasing you. Life doesn't show up on your door and knock on your door and say, I'm here. You have to be ready for it every day. And through everything that I've been through, if I can help one person understand that that's what they have to do, they're meant for something. They're meant for something more than what they're doing, and that they can do it. Because if one person can do it, they can do it. And they have to live their dreams and their goals and their life every day, like tomorrow might not happen. Because there are no guarantees. And I learned that. I learned that from my mother. I learned that from my brother. And I want to help other people understand it. You know, I think that you have to care. I think that's really important, especially in today's world, where it seems like nobody cares. Everybody walks around and their nose is 2 inches from their little screen. And, you know, my father was a very caring person. And, you know, Dr. Martin Luther King said, people don't know care how much you know until they know how much you care. And I learned that from my dad. You know, my dad loved people. And people genuinely seemed to love him. He always made time for people. And, you know, I'll never forget there was a time when I was a little kid, I spent as much time as I could with my father. I went everywhere with him. So much so that when my father left the house, my mother would say, don't forget your shadow. And then she would also say to him, you better never stop short. That kid will be right up your backside. Because I loved my dad, and I just loved being around him. And we owned a chain of bakery shops and coffee shops. And sometimes in the afternoon, stores would run out of product. They would run out of donuts. And as a little kid, I would get to go with my dad and bring more donuts to the store. Well, I'll never forget this one day. We're delivering donuts to one of the stores that ran out. And as I jumped out of the station wagon and ran to the back of the car to open up the door to start unloading the boxes, there was a boy walking down the street. But this boy didn't look like any boy I had ever seen before. Now, I was young. Maybe I was 7, 8 years old. And this boy comes walking down the street, and he comes walking up to the back of the car like he's going to help. And I'm, no, what are you doing? And my father says, it's okay. He can help us. And, I'm 8 years old. I don't want to share my time with my father with anybody. I'm jealous. So I pouted and stood back. And, after a moment, my father said, come on now, pitch in. And I did. And the three of us were unloading the car, bringing the donuts into the store. And still, I could not figure out what was so different about this boy. But when we were done, my father brought him a bag of glazed donuts and handed them to him and said, thank you. And you would have seen the look on his face. It lit up like the 4th of July. And then he spoke. And he said, thank you. And he spoke in a voice that was different from any voice I had ever heard. So not only did he look different, but he sounded different. And when I got in the car, my father said, did you see how happy that made him? Just allowing him to help and be a part of what we were doing. Look what it did for him. He said, doesn't that make you feel good? And he was right. I did feel good. It made me smile to help make someone else so happy. It wasn't till years later that I really understood the meaning of that day. See, my cousin Stephen was born with Down syndrome. And when I met him and got to spend time with him, it came back to me that the boy that had helped us that very day was born to the same circumstances. See, we're all going through something. We all have whatever we have. If I've got something, you've got something, everyone has something. And never should we think what we're going through is any harder than what anybody else is going through. Pain is relative. And everybody's pain matters. And I think we need to care a little more about each other in the world, because we have to care about our brothers and sisters, because I'm going to tell you, we're all we've got. To my knowledge, they have not found anybody else floating around in the universe. So this is it. I've got you and you've got me. There's an African phrase. It's called Ubuntu. And the meaning is your happiness is my happiness. And there's a story behind it where there's a group of children sitting down, and there's a man doing a study about humanism. And he puts a giant basket of fruit under a tree. And he says to the kids, he says, here's what I'm going to do. We're going to have a race. And the person who arrives at the tree first gets to keep the whole basket of fruit. And they all agree. So he says, they all stand up, and he says, are we ready? And they say, we're ready. And he says, all right, go. And they locked arms, and they all walked to the tree together. Because how could any one of them get all that fruit and be happy while their friends were not? So we have to look out for each other. We have to care about each other. Because like I said, we're all we've got. And that's what I want to help people understand, that in today's world, they have to care. They have to care about the person next to them as much, if not more, than they care about themselves. And hopefully, the person next to them will do the same. For years I taught youth sports, and I would tell the kids, when you want it really bad, that's great. But when you want it bad for your teammate, more than you want it for yourself, if you want to give something and you want your teammate to experience something more than you want it for yourself, that's when you're a winner. Because that's what it's all about. It's not about you, it's about them. It's about what can you do for someone else. Like Zig Ziglar says, you will get everything you want in life. My dad, he went through a lot. And what he learned was he was in a machine shop in Rhode Island. And he wanted to advance. He had a wife, he had children, he wanted to move up. And he went to the foreman, and he said, how do I get ahead? And the foreman says, well, you see the guy over there? He says, when he dies, you get his job. And that was enough for my father to say no. There's more. There's more I can do. I have to do something more. And he took his family and he moved to Connecticut, and he opened up a small coffee and bakery shop. My uncle helped him get started, and he learned all these things, these little life lessons and these things going forward. And what was great is he was always one, he would share his knowledge with anyone. He never felt that he should keep it all for himself. He wanted to share it with other people so that they could understand and benefit from, if they could, from something maybe that he knew. And what he did in such a way with me was he would share it in a way that he would want me to develop my own critical thinking skills. He wouldn't exactly tell me what to do or exactly how to do it, but he would tell me, well, if I was you, I might do this, or I might do that. But you're going to have to figure it out for yourself. But he was always willing to share the knowledge that he learned. But he knew that it's great. He understood that you have to figure it out for yourself. People can give you the blueprint, but you still have to build the house yourself. And that's what he tried to do. And he was always knowledgeable. He would always say things like, well, what are you going to do now? How are you going to figure that out? He was always putting it on you. He was there. He was supportive. He was always giving you his advice. And he was giving you the advice in hopes that you might not stumble through what he stumbled through. Well, he was a happy guy, my dad. I mean, even through all that he went through, the stroke, the heart attack, the broken hip, the crushed knee, he always was happy. I'm still here, smile on his face. He was always joyful. And he would be happy to see you, and he would give you his time when he saw you. He was happy to talk to you. He would just loved. I'll never forget one Christmas. My mother didn't really love to spend money, but one thing my father loved to do was spend money on my mom. And I'll never forget, in the back, my dad carried a billfold. That's what he called it. He's old school, billfold, right? And in the back of the wallet was a zipper. And I'll never forget, as a young boy, one day I peeked inside the zipper. And I saw a lot of $100 bills. So I had to ask. And I said to Dad, why do you carry all that money in cash in your wallet? He said, son, you never know when your mother's going to want to buy something. He had the same $100 bills in that wallet forever. And when he bought a new wallet, he transferred them to the new wallet. But he was always willing. He was always willing to share and to do and to give. And I'll never forget, one year he bought her a mink coat for Christmas. Now, my dad worked really hard. And my parents worked hard, and we all worked hard. My brothers worked hard as well, and they did well. My family did well. And I'll never forget, he bought her a mink coat for Christmas. She took it out of the box. She wore it around all morning and then put it back in the box and said, okay, you can bring it back now. But my father was always generous with his time, with his money. He was just a generous person. I'll never forget one Christmas, my father bought my mother a mink coat. Now, my family did well. They worked hard. And they weren't one for extravagant things. My dad wore the same polyester pants every day, and he was just, they were humble. They were who they were. And I'll never forget, he bought her a mink coat for Christmas. And when she opened the box and she saw that coat, just a huge smile across her face and a huge smile on my father's face. It made him so happy to make her that happy. And I'll never forget, she put the coat on, she wore it around all morning. And then she put it back in the box. And she said to my father, okay, you can take it back to the store. And it wasn't that she didn't appreciate what it took, the money, the time, the effort, the belief that he wanted her to have it. It wasn't any of that. For her, it just wasn't who she was. But she was appreciative, and he wanted her to have nice things. And even if she couldn't keep them for herself, it made him happy knowing that he could make her that happy just for a moment. He was a generous man, and he loved to make other people smile. My dad was a generous guy, and he liked to be the big tipper. And I'll never forget the story where here he was. He didn't have a lot of time, but he was generous with his time. Of course, I wanted it all for myself because I didn't want to share them with anybody. But he was part of Unico in our town, and that's an organization of business owners, and they would do civic-minded things for the town, and he would give his time. And they had a luncheon. Every week they would meet at a different spot, and they would have a luncheon. And my dad rarely slowed down to eat lunch. Usually it was a cup of coffee. And on that day, he ordered a cup of coffee, and they finished their meeting, and he left. He paid for his coffee, and he left a $5 tip on the table and walked out. And out in the parking lot comes running the waitress, waving the $5 bill. Mr. Ponte, Mr. Ponte, Mr. Ponte, you overpaid your bill. And he turned around and he smiled and he said to her, he said, no, I didn't. He said, that's for you. That's your tip. See, my father appreciated good service. He appreciated how hard people worked, and oftentimes understood that people worked that hard were very rarely appreciated. So he was generous with his money to the point where he wanted it to go where he knew it could do the most good, directly into the hands of the person who was working hard. He would always say, a good employee is worth $1 more an hour every day of the week. And our employees were hourly. Most of them were part-time. But my father always paid more than most, because he felt that if you worked hard, you deserved to get paid. And if you cared about what you were doing while you worked hard, you deserved to get paid more. So he was generous. He was generous with his time. He was generous with himself. He coached sports. He was generous with his money when he could be, for others, never for himself. The only thing he bought for himself, my dad, he bought Florsheim shoes, wingtips. Always a brown pair, always a black pair. And it's the only thing I can remember that he ever bought for himself. That was it. Everything else he did was for other people. It was for us as children, or for my mother, or for his parents before they passed away, or his sisters. He was always thinking of others. Always. But when they told me that he wanted me to do the eulogy, I was a little shocked and surprised, and I was honored, of course, but I figured my brother would do it, his namesake. And it was amazing to stand up in front of the crowd and to give the eulogy on my dad, because he had meant so much to me. He was my Superman growing up. And what was great was, the two most influential people in my life were my dad and my grandfather, my papi. And, the apple, they say, doesn't fall far from the tree, and my father sure didn't fall far from my grandfather's tree, because my papi would always say, he had one question he would always ask you, and he said, are you being a good boy? That's what he would say. And he doted on my grandmother, who was tough. My grandmother was tough. She was, John, do you have your hat, John? John, did you eat your lunch, John? And she was always on him, but I in all the years I knew my grandfather, I only ever heard him raise his voice once. But he was just something special, and it passed on to my dad, and it means so much to me to have eulogized him. And my cousin, who's in his 60s now, and said to his wife, he said, when I go, I want Michael to do my eulogy. Because he was impressed with it. But it was easy to give my father's eulogy. It just poured out, because there were so many great things to say about him. But I feel fortunate to have known him. It's interesting. I don't have any. I have very few memories of my father before his stroke. That's the man I know. I know the man after the stroke. I've seen pictures of him before the stroke, and I have glimpses of memories before the stroke, but everything is after the stroke. So when my mom passed away, I was 15 years old, and as I said, being the youngest in a big family, and especially having 4 older brothers, nobody really cares what you know. Nobody cares what you think. I grew up with, be seen and not heard, and go where you're told and do what you're told. And when my mom died, it was really hard. And I can remember sitting in the funeral parlor, and the priest bringing me. I had lost it. I had just broken down, and I was sitting there. It was, I don't know, the 3rd session of the wake, and staring at the casket, and the priest, they gave me some Tylenol and took me in the other room, and he came and sat down with me, and he said to me, he said, you should be really happy now. He said, your mother's in a better place. And I looked at this man, and I had been 9 years of Catholic school, and I understood, and she wasn't the first person in my life that had passed away, but she was the most important person in my life that had passed away. And I looked at this man, and I thought to myself, he's an idiot. He's crazy. Because I don't care that she might be in a better place. All I care about is that I'm 15 and I want my mother. And it was hard. And I floundered emotionally from there going forward because it was really hard. Nobody talked in my family about it. Men don't talk. They don't open up. I can remember being at the dinner table at my brother John's house, and his oldest son at the time, he couldn't have been more than, 4 or 5 years old, and we were having dinner, and he just blurted out, he says, "Where's Grandma?" And my brother just got up and walked away from the table. Nobody talked. Nobody talked about it. Nobody talked about how they felt. I even have one older brother who said to me that he had lost more than I had because he knew her longer. So therefore he had lost more. And I don't fault him for it because he was hurting just as bad as I was. But I thought to myself, that's great. I said, she saw you graduate high school. She saw you get your driver's license. She saw you get married. And she'll never see any of those things from me. And there was a time, one of my brothers owned a liquor store. And behind the counter, he kept a gun. He kept a handgun. And I would work for him, so I had a key. And there were 3 separate occasions where I went to that store, opened the door, unlocked the door after hours, went in and broke down and sat behind the counter with the gun in my hand. And I thought to myself, I just don't want to do this anymore. This is really hard. And the thing was, I didn't really want to die, but the life that I was living, I just didn't really want to live because it wasn't fun. It was hard. It was hard. And, at that moment, I heard a little voice in my head, and I could hear my dad whenever someone would ask him how he was doing, and he would say, "I'm still here." And I thought to myself, if my father could go through everything that he went through having his knee crushed and his leg almost amputated, through a stroke and a broken hip and a heart attack and open heart surgery and losing my mother, that what am I doing? Sitting here in the dark by myself, ready to just give up. And I realized that I wasn't exactly sure who I wanted to be, but I knew at that moment who I didn't want to be. And what I didn't want to be was someone who gave up. I owed it to my father. I owed it to myself to keep going until I found myself, found who I wanted to be, found what my purpose was. But I think about that moment a lot. I think about how in a moment I could have just ended it all. And now as I was sitting there and thinking about my father and thinking about he never gave up, how could I give up? A question came into my mind. And I said to myself, I heard the voice and it said, what if suicide wasn't an option? What would I do? How would I live my life if suicide wasn't an option? What would I do with the pain that I was feeling, and how would I deal with what I was going through? The loneliness that I felt in a family of 6. Imagine being in a family of 6 and feeling lonely because it felt like no one cared. It felt like no one cared about how I felt, about my pain. So I thought about, well, what would I do? If suicide wasn't an option, what would I do? And in my mind, you're either going forward or you're going backwards. You're either living or you're dying. And at that moment, I realized I had to start living. I had to let go of the past. I had to let go of the pain. And I'm not going to say that there weren't moments going forward where I didn't find myself in that same space again. But at least now I knew how to get through it. I had the tools. I understood that this was temporary. And I definitely didn't want to have a permanent solution to a temporary problem. So at that moment, I had to realize, what if suicide's not an option? What would I do with my life? How would I deal with what I was going through? And that's what I actually had to do, was start dealing with it. Instead of letting it run my life, I had to start running my life. I had to deal with what I was feeling. I had to talk to somebody about what I was feeling. Because even though I felt alone, I wasn't alone. There were people that cared. There were people that would open up. I had to find them. And I had to find myself. And I had to find the strength to do that. So you know what one of the biggest problems is?
What?
Is that it's increased in young people.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
my boys, who you spoke to today, who are 19, have known 3 friends that before they were the age of 17, who all killed themselves. Matthew is a boy who lived, when we moved to Florida, we moved into a neighborhood, and Matthew was a boy in the neighborhood. And he walked to school every day, middle school, with my boys. And he got into high school. He was doing something with the Navy. He was swimming. He had it. It looked like he had it all going on. And let me tell you, this kid was a funny kid. He was that prankster in school. He played a prank in middle school where he got a hold of those slips that they give out to the kids, those detention slips, and he gave one to the wrong kid because the kid freaked out and called his mom, and Mom, I'm in trouble, and so they suspended him. And I'll never forget, I'll see him, he said, hey, Mr. Ponte, how you doing? I said, listen, Matt, I said, I'm not going to lie to you. I said, that's one of the funniest gags I've ever heard of. I said, but you got to be careful who you play that on. I said, because, some kids just can't handle it. And he was a just bright smile, big face on this kid. And he lived 5 houses down. And he hung himself in the house. And we went to the services, and they had him dressed in his Navy uniform. And I thought about my 2 boys sitting there, and my son Alex just sat down and he started to cry. And I thought about myself and what I went through. And I thought about this kid who, whenever young people pass away or someone commits suicide or something happens, all of a sudden they're anointed. Everyone talks about they were the light of the earth and the bright bulb in the room, but somebody was missing something, for sure. Because I can tell you from personal experience, it's not something that you think about for 5 minutes and do. It's something that's ongoing. And something in Matthew's life was ongoing. And we're emotional beings, and sometimes our emotions get the best of us, but there was something we all missed in him. And that was really hard because he was such a good kid, and he lived, right around the corner. He spent time in my kitchen. I would tell the kids that come into my house, I'm like, listen, I'm not going to get up and wait on you. You know where the refrigerator is. You're on your own. And he was always that kid. He'd come in the house and he'd hang in the kitchen a little. He would sit there and talk to my wife, and he was just that kid. But we lost him. And I believe we lost him like we lose so many kids, because either we're not communicating from a place of openness where they feel free to communicate from a place of openness, that they feel either no one cares or no one understands what they're going through. And for me, that's a big deal. I'll never forget when I wrote out my first feelings about what I went through, and Deborah said to me, she goes, are you really going to talk about that? And I said, I have to. So that maybe, just maybe, if I can share what I went through, what's happened to me, maybe, just maybe, there will be one kid in the audience who's thinking that today's the day that he'll rethink it, and he'll talk to me, or he'll talk to someone, because there's always someone to listen, but sometimes you have to find them, and you have to share where you are and how you're feeling, because you're not the first person. This is what I try to tell people. You're not the first person who's ever felt this way. You're not the first person. Everyone always thinks that their pain is the worst pain. And the more you talk from a free space, other people feel free to talk to you. And that's one thing I've always tried to do is there's not anything of me that I won't share in hopes that someone will feel free to share of themselves. Most people who commit suicide, they tell somebody. They leave a trail. They give a signal because they don't really want to do it. There are very few people that really want to die. But the thing is, we're so busy in life, we forget this. We forget to communicate with each other. I mean, I have a niece who lives now out in California. She's young. She's 21 years old. I'll never forget. My sister was visiting. She FaceTimed and said, "Mom, I need to speak to you." So I said to my sister, "Answer it." So she answered, and my niece said, "Mom, I just got out of one of my lecture classes, and a girl came up to me, introduced herself, and asked if I wanted to hang out." And my sister and I looked at each other, and I spoke up. I said, "Oh, okay." I said, and she goes, "Who does that?" I mean, that's what she said. She said, "Who does that?" And I thought to myself, people do that. But here she is at this age that she's gone through this age of technology where they don't know how to communicate with each other anymore. So the fact that a person would walk up to her and introduce themselves, who she had never met but was in class together, and they have everything in common. People say, "Well, we have nothing in common." You're breathing, you're human, you have everything in common. And I said to her, I said, "Well, let me ask you a question. Is there something that you're afraid of?" I said, "Are you worried that there's a different concept, a different meaning, maybe a sexual orientation?" I said, "What is it that's bothering you?" She goes, I just don't, who does that?" She said it again. I said, "My suggestion to you is go hang out. Go get to know the person that had the courage to walk up to you and introduce themselves. Put down your phone and spend time with people." Because even my kids do it. They don't hang out, get together. They hang out on their phone. They'll watch a movie, and there'll be 6 kids texting about the movie on the phone instead of being together in the presence of each other. And we wonder why we don't feel free to open up and to tell somebody how we're feeling or what we're going through. Because we're afraid of the response that we might not get. It's sad.
Afraid, maybe, but also just unfamiliar because they haven't done it, which could be leading to the fear.
Yeah.
But the technology has gotten to the point where they don't know how to. You're right. They don't know how to communicate.
No.
They not only communicate like this, but they don't know how to write like longhand. This short text. How do you communicate in an interview? They haven't had that exposure. So
you're right.
Fear, but also just uncertainty, as another. Maybe.
Well, the thing is, I mean, for me, so I went to Catholic school 9 years, and I was the kind of, we learned that when you talk to somebody, you look somebody in the eye. So when I talk to people, and I think sometimes it freaks them out because I'm staring at them, but I'm listening and paying attention. And the eyes are the window to the soul, and you learn so much just by watching and listening and learning. And for me, when I went away to school and I took notes, I'll never forget, I was in high school and the teacher came over and looked at my notepad. She said, "You're writing down every word I say." I said, "I am." And she said, "Why?" I said, "Well, you're the teacher, so I figured everything you were saying is important." And, when I moved on from high school, in high school I was in grammar school I was a great student. In high school I was a horrible student because I didn't want to be there. I had, dealt with so much with my family and my head just wasn't in it. But, people were my thing. I would rather just spend time around people. But, the idea that we're so afraid to talk to somebody, I look at the idea of rejection and I say to people, there's no such thing as rejection. There's no such thing. And they look at me like I have two heads. And I say to them, well, understand, if you walk up to someone and you introduce yourself, and I give an example. I say, have you ever seen the 90-pound girl with the 300-pound guy? Or have you ever seen the 300-pound guy with the 300-pound girl with the 90-pound guy? I said, if someone doesn't like you, it's not that they're rejecting you. It's that they're rejecting something in themselves. You're just not their cup of tea. It says nothing about you. Nothing whatsoever about you. It just means that you're not their flavor. But what we do to ourselves is we make it about us, and we make it something's wrong with us. So we're afraid to communicate with people because out of fear of we might not fit in, or we're not the right choice, or we're not going to win, or we're not going to be picked first. But it doesn't matter. One of the biggest things though is just to be willing.
What?
Be willing. Be willing to put yourself out there. What's the story is that you see the kid at the dance, and the pretty girl sits there all by herself. Why? Because everyone's afraid to go over to her and ask her to dance. And then all of a sudden, here comes, I don't care, Poindexter's got the glasses and whatever's going on. He walks over and asks her to dance. She says yes, because he had the courage to do it. But I've told that story before, about, I used it in my talk in Connecticut. That, what do you want to do now? Your husband's passed away. Well, he left me with a lot of money, so I don't need to work. Well, why don't you travel? Well, I traveled with my husband, so I don't need to travel. So is there something you've always wanted to do? She says, I've always wanted to be a lawyer. And her friend says, great, we'll do that. She goes, no, I can't do that. She says, why? She said, well, because it takes 7 years to become a lawyer. And she said, Gladys, how old are you? She said, I'm 50. And she said, so if you go to law school and graduate, how old will you be? She said, 57. She said, okay. If you don't go to law school and graduate and become a lawyer, how old will you be in 7 years? She said, 57. She said, well, if you're going to be 57 anyway, you might as well do what you want to do. Well, for me, it's coming from a place of, I was a fat little kid. We made donuts for a living. I mean, put that together. I mean, I walk in the store every day and grab a donut and chomp down. So I was a fat little kid. I wore the husky size. And, I didn't like it, but my mother would always say, don't worry, you'll grow out of it. And she would always say, all your brothers were the same, and they grew out of it. And, it was, I came from a place of, and, even now, most people I tell them, they'd laugh, they don't think so. But, I'm about as insecure as you can find. And the thing is, like the little dog that barks at the big dog, I developed that shell, that outer bravado to hide my insecurities. And, I'll never forget. So my sister in college had a moment where she didn't think she wanted to go on. And she ended up in the hospital, and she came home for a brief period. And I'll never forget, we were sitting in the driveway and we were talking. And I gave her this whole talk about how you can't give up. Never did I tell her that I hadn't ever told anyone at that point that I had almost given up. And she talked about how she felt. So she was at a school called Fairfield University, and my 2 older brothers had graduated from there. 3 of my cousins had graduated from there. My sister-in-law had graduated from there. It was a school that a lot of family had gone to. But from the time my brothers went there to the time my sister was there, the makeup of the school changed. And my sister shared, she goes, well, I'm just out of place there. I said, what does that mean? And she said, well, all the girls I know, their fathers are doctors or lawyers or whatever. She goes, our dad's a baker. Our family, we're bakers. And I said, well, that's ridiculous. I said, to think that somebody is better than you because of what their parents do, I said, that's ridiculous. And she said, well, that's easy for you to say because you think you're better than everybody else. And I said, you know what? I'm going to let you know a little secret. I said, I don't think I'm better than anybody else. I said, but I sure as hell don't think anybody else is any better than me. And, I think about that now. And there's people out there in the world that do things that get paid, $20 million to act. And George Clooney, he can act, but he puts his pants on the same way I do. And I don't know if he can cook, but I can cook. And he just gets paid more at his job than I get paid at mine. But that's always been a little thing for me that I've worn as a badge, is that, believe me, I know there's people that are smarter than me. I know there's people that are brighter than me. I know that there's people that work harder than me. But I don't think that anybody's any better than me. Or at least I know I can be better maybe than what I am right now. But, we're all the same. We're all equal. There ain't nobody any better than anybody else. To me, living a meaningful life is, with everything that's happened in my life, I do think about the end. I do think about someday, when I won't be here anymore. And I've told my wife that I don't care what else she puts on my headstone. Loving father, husband, brother, whatever, son. I said, all I really care that matters to me, that shows up on my headstone, is that the words say, "Here lies a person who cared." Because that's really important to me. Because for so long when I was little, I just didn't think that anybody really cared about me. And I was wrong. I was wrong when I thought that. But it took time to understand that. Not everybody had every moment to just deal with what was wrong with Michael. They were dealing with their own things. But living a meaningful life to me means, in my business in real estate, I got a call from the incoming president of the association, and he called and he said, "Michael, it's John Gonzalez." I said, "Hey, John, how are you?" He says, "Great." He says, "I'm wondering if you'll be on the strategic planning committee." And I didn't say anything. He said, "Are you there?" I said, "I'm here." I said, "Are you sure you meant to call me?" And he laughed and he says, "Yeah, why would you say that?" I said, "I don't know." I said, John, it's not really me. I don't really get involved. That's not what I do." But he laughed and he says, "I don't think you really know yourself all that well then." And I said, "Well, I don't know." I said, "Why would anybody want to hear what I have to say?" And he says, "Well, I want you to consider it." So I went home and I told my wife, I said, "I got a call today from the president of the board. He wants me to sit on some committee." And she goes, "Great, you should do it." I said, "I don't know." And she said, "Well, why?" I said, "I don't know. I just don't think, why is somebody going to want to care or have to care about what I have to say?" And she says, "You need to get over yourself." And, I've always said, I married up, way up. And, Deborah is always pushed me to believe in myself. Even though I come off like I believe in myself, I'm a lot of times I'm just terrified inside. And I'm always shocked and amazed when anybody knows who I am. Even in my small little town, and I'm successful. I do well at what I do, and but I never attribute that they know me because of me. I attribute that they know me because of the guy that I work for, because I work for the big dog in the town. And I just don't consider myself all that important. But the interesting thing that I've come to learn through the help of other people, and especially my wife, is that I'm always involved. There's not a person that walks by me that I don't stop and talk to, or try to help, or sit and listen to, or help them understand what I've learned. But I tend to get involved one-on-one. And not in the group, because in the group I'm that scared fat little kid who doesn't want to be laughed at. But living a meaningful life means to me is if what I dealt with, if what I went through can help anybody, one person, go forward or think about themselves differently, I'll gladly take that insecurity and carry it forward, because it's important to me. People are important to me. For years, I had difficulties with my family. My 2 oldest brothers I didn't talk to for 5 years. My oldest brother is my godfather. We didn't speak for 5 years. I didn't invite them to my wedding. My father begged me. I said no. My wife begged me. I said no. And my brother, one of my other brothers said, well, how about this? He said, what if they come to the bachelor party? I said, well, if they show up to the bachelor party, I said, I'll send them an invitation to the wedding. And the reason I wouldn't send them an invitation to the wedding because I was afraid they'd say no. And then how would I feel? Or I was afraid they'd show up. And then how would I feel? So, and then the 2 younger of the 4 brothers, I went through a period where I didn't speak to them for 5 years. And, I've mended those fences. And it was, my wife pushed. The twins were born, and I came home one day, and Deborah said, okay, that's it. I can't deal with this anymore. You need to go fix it. Whatever it is you need to fix with your brothers. And I said, I don't know. She said, I don't care. And I said, okay. And I walked into the donut shop. I asked if my brother was there. The girl looked at me like, because they all know who we are, and they all know who I'm not, what's going on. And my brother came out, and he looked at me, and I said, do you have time for lunch? And he said, yeah, I have time for lunch. And I said, will you have lunch with me? And he said, he paused for a moment, but he said, yeah. He said, let me just tell Maria, his wife, where I'm going. I said, okay. And I had a friend who had a deli in town, and it was after lunch, and he closed the deli, and so it could just be us sitting in there. Because he knew what I was dealing with, and he wanted to help. And I sat down with my brother, and I said, I told him, I said, this doesn't work anymore. I said, and, I'm going to tell you right now, I said, you did what you did because you thought it was right, and I did what I did because I thought it was right. And he wanted to discuss the whole matter and get in, and I said, I don't want to go there. I said, here's what I want to do. I said, I'm Michael and you're Tony, and I want to move forward from today on and have a brand new relationship. I said, I want to forget everything that ever happened before. I said, and if you can do that, I said, and because I'm willing to do that, I said, then, we can let everything go. I said, but if you're not, I said, here's my hand, shake it. It's been nice knowing you. And all of a sudden the fear came out because he wasn't sure. And deep down inside, I said, oh my God, I can't imagine that I'm going to muster this gumption up and he's going to say no. And he said, well, I'll have to talk to Maria. And I found out later on, he went home and that was it. She, just like my wife had enough, his wife had had enough. And she said, I don't care how you feel. She said, do you know what it took for him to walk in that store and invite you to lunch? That's it. This is over. And he called, and the next brother I had to talk to was my brother John. And he's the easy one. I called him and I said, hey, I want to talk to you. He says, what about? And I said, he's always short. And I told him. He says, yeah, that's good. He goes, I'm good with that. He says, you'll have to talk to Rose on your own. He says, but I'm good with that. And it was not long after that, a couple of years later, he died. And he came to the house. We had a little party. And he left. They had to go somewhere. And I'll never forget it. I was in my second house, and he went somewhere with his wife, and on the way back, he had to pass right by my house to go to his house. And he says, I wonder if Michael has any of those sandwiches left. And she goes, I'm sure he does. And they stopped. And, we ate and sat and talked. And I tell you, I don't know what my life would be like if I hadn't mended that relationship before he passed away. It's that was really hard. That was really hard.